Denizens of the night, welcome to another episode of the macabre, the terrifying. Broadcasting live from a spatial anomaly in the Rendlesham forest, I will be your guide through the witching hours. Tonight, we'll enjoy a coming-of-age story of sorts. Making friends can be challenging for some people, and it only gets more difficult as you age. But the protagonist of tonight's story has a hard time because his family moves around so much. Well, imagine his delight when he makes a wonderful new friend at school. And imagine his trepidation as they go deeper and deeper into the woods to feed his friends a weird pet. This story is called A Boy at School Took Me to a Place in the Forest Where He'd Been Feeding a Spider, and was written by Disco Dingus. My dad was a proud airman for the U.S. Air Force, but that meant we moved around a lot, which I could never get used to. When I was 8 years old, we moved to the UK for 3 years, and by the time I was 10, we'd lived on 4 different USAF bases within England and Wales. Always being the new kid at school was exhausting. It didn't help that I sounded different too, so I'd often get made fun of. One school I went to had a group of kids that sang Yankee Doodle every time they saw me. When I tried to join in, they made it clear I wasn't welcome. Sometimes I struggled to understand the other kids too, the accents sounding like a foreign language to me. Most of the time I was alone, and it sucked. Tale as old as time, I know. But that changed when we moved to the Bent Waters base in Suffolk in the early 90s. On my first week of attending a new school, I shared a table with a boy one lunch break. We got to talking because we both had Teenage Mutant Hero Turtle lunchboxes. Ninja was replaced with Hero in the UK. His favorite turtle was Donatello because of his interest in science, and mine was Michelangelo for 2 simple reasons. My name was Michael, and I loved pizza. "I'm Adrian," he said, holding out his hand. "I'm Mike," I said, grinning on account of making a friend and it being the first time I ever shook hands with someone. It felt so grown up. He didn't laugh at the way I talked, and I could understand him just fine. Adrian was the first kid in school I invited to one of my birthday parties, it usually being just a couple of kids on the base. I remember him being so excited to go bowling and try Dunkin' Donuts for the first time. He lived in a small village called Ake, around a 15-minute bike ride from me. As I lived on the base, it wasn't like he could just visit whenever he wanted. Unless my parents had arranged for him to come over for pizza or stay the night, it was a lot easier for me to visit him. I spent most of my weekends and the summer break in or around Ake going on adventures in the British countryside. There was a nearby fruit farm that we'd sneak onto through a gap in the hedge, then proceed to give ourselves stomach cramps by eating too many strawberries. We climbed trees, made rope swings, and set up obstacle courses for our BMXs. It was the best time of my life for a while. Then, one lazy day, as we laid watching the clouds, Adrian changed everything. "There's this amazing place I visit in the forest sometimes. I found it by chance last year because I fell off my bike." I sat up. "If it's amazing, why haven't we already been?" He shrugged. "I didn't want you to think I was weird or something." "Why would I think that?" "Well, there's this spider," he said. "I've been feeding it." You've been feeding a spider? I asked, a bit confused. Yeah, do you want to see it? I don't know, Adrian, I said, feeling icky. Spiders give me the heebie-jeebies. Honestly, Mike, it's amazing. Let me show you, please. I agreed to go with him, so we hopped on our bikes to Rendlesham Forest. If that sounds familiar to some of you, it could be because there was a famous incident in 1980 involving unexplained lights, known as Britain's Roswell. When we moved there, my dad joked about getting abducted by aliens, which simultaneously amused and terrified me. Adrian's parents had spoken about it too, as they lived in that area at the time, which was a couple of years before he was born. They said it was a load of nonsense. We took the usual route to the forest, but he cut off from the main path after several minutes. It was overgrown with ferns and nettles. My legs got stung a little bit, but it was nothing I wasn't used to. I was concerned that we were going further into the forest than I'd been before, though. My parents would ground me for weeks if they knew I was here, I called to Adrian, who was slightly ahead. It's not far now, he called back. I was relieved when he stopped and leaned his bike against a tree. I propped up my bike on the opposite side and joined him. We were standing on the edge of what looked like a crater, with steep sides lined with plant life. It was about 15 feet down and at least 100 feet across. There were a few trees and rock formations inside it. I fell down there, said Adrian, pointing into the crater. I knocked my shoulder a bit, but apart from that I was fine. You were lucky, I said. Imagine if you'd broken a leg or something. Who'd have known you were here? Well, I didn't, he said. I found something incredible instead. Is the spider down there? I asked. Yeah, but we need to get its food first. I'll admit that Adrian was smarter than me. I mean, he was Donatello and I was Michelangelo. But I knew that spiders didn't eat berries and leaves. Are we going to catch bugs? I asked. We caught a lot of grasshoppers in the grain fields around Ake, but we always let them go. Not quite, he said. I read about traps in the library and set some up around here. For what? He didn't answer me, but walked with his head down to various locations around the crater, like he knew exactly where to look. Then he gasped. Yes! I got one! I heard a scurrying sound. Then Adrian pulled a rabbit from the ferns. It had a snare made of twine around one of its legs. Why did you catch a rabbit? I asked. He released the snare and held the rabbit to his chest. It was alive, but didn't put up much of a fight. It had probably been trapped for days. Come on, he said. Follow me. Be careful, it's a little steep. He began to slowly descend into the crater at a sideways angle. I stood at the top and watched him, feeling uncomfortable. Are you coming? He asked. Tell me why you have a rabbit, I said. He grinned. You have to see it for yourself, Mike. I took a few deep breaths and stepped down, slowly shuffling my body. I slipped a couple of times, but steadied myself. When I met Adrian at the bottom, it somehow looked a little brighter, and it was considerably warmer. I looked at him in surprise, and he gave me a knowing smile. You feel it, don't you? It was British summertime, so it was warm, but the crater had a similar feel to Hawaii, where we lived for 6 months while my dad was stationed there. I don't understand, I said. It never changes down here, Mike, he said. When I came in January, it was snowing up there. Down here, it was just like this. hot, no snow at all." I shook my head. "That's not possible." "I promise, it's the truth. It can be raining cats and dogs up there, but as soon as you get down here, there's no rain, only humidity." I followed as he started walking towards the center of the crater. As we got closer, I could see the rocks forming the mouth of a cave. The ground in front of the cave was a bed of silk that wove into a funnel, disappearing into darkness. It reminded me of the webs that lined the drain pipes during dry spells, only this was on a freakishly large scale. Thick strands of silk also streamed from the treetops high above, shimmering in the sun. My heart rate increased. "Adrian? I don't like this." "Wait here," he said, walking closer to the cave. He held the rabbit with both hands, and I saw its back legs kick out as he put it on the ground. It moved a little, maybe a foot or so, and then became entangled in the silk. Adrian came back to me and put his hand on my shoulder. As the rabbit struggled, I began to notice the skulls and bones of various small animals scattered around. I got a shiver. "How big is this spider?" I stuttered. His hand tightened on my shoulder. I saw the silk vibrate, and the rabbit froze, which made me freeze. There was a sudden flash of something dark emerging from the cave, and I was running back to where we'd come from. "Mike!" I heard Adrian yell from behind, but I was scrambling up the crater's edge after knocking my elbow on something. I had no time to notice the pain. My feet kept slipping in my panicked state, but I pulled myself up by grabbing fistfuls of wild plants. I rode like the wind all the way back to Bentwaters, not looking back. I didn't see Adrian for a few days, and when he called my house, I told Mom to say I was grounded. She asked if we'd had a fight, and I felt it was better to just go along with that. I went into the nearby town of Woodbridge with Mom for shopping. There was a 7-Eleven there. Dad said the locals complained because it Americanized the community, but I loved that I could still drink Slurpees in the UK. Mom bought me one and left me on a bench while she went to post some letters back to the U.S. "Hello, Michael," said a woman. I looked up to see Adrian's mom. I smiled awkwardly. "Hello." "Are you here all on your own?" she asked. "No, Mom's in the postal shop." She nodded and sat next to me. "Oh, dear. What did you do to your arm?" "I had a bruised elbow from knocking it during my crater dash." "I think I hit it on a tree when we were playing in the forest." "Boys will be boys," she chuckled. "I hear you had a disagreement." I looked at the ground and shrugged. "I guess." "Well, I do hope you patch things up. Adrian's been over the moon since the two of you became friends. He was becoming a bit of a loner after losing Kevin." I turned to her. "Who's Kevin?" She looked at me with a surprised expression. "Oh my, I assumed he would have told you. Kevin was his best friend. He went missing without a trace last year. So terribly sad. His poor parents. They lost a child and have to listen to those darn conspiracy theorists and their UFO rubbish." I stared at her with my mouth wide open. She cleared her throat and stood up. "I'm sorry, Michael. That's too much for a child. Tell your mother I said hello. And please call Adrian. He misses you." I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. Why hadn't Adrian told me about Kevin? It was such a big thing to not mention at all, especially as I felt we were so close. The next day I was thinking about calling him when it started to rain. It can be raining cats and dogs up there, but as soon as you get down here, there's no rain. Call it a moment of madness, but I had to see for myself. I put on a raincoat and went to leave the house. "Where are you going?" asked Mom. "Just to Adrian's," I lied. Mom smiled. "You guys made up then. I'll give you a ride." "No," I said a little too firmly. "It's fine, Mom. I don't mind a bit of rain." She laughed in disbelief. "Suit yourself. Be careful." I rode straight to Rendlesham Forest, wondering if I was going to be able to find my way to the crater without Adrian. It took me a while, but I did. The forest was a dull gray due to the rain clouds, which gave the crater a dull appearance too. As I began to make my way down, I slipped on wet leaves, but this time I couldn't steady myself. I rolled to the bottom of the crater's edge, landing on my front. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The sound of rain had ceased completely. When I slowly lifted my head, I noticed the ground was dry. The temperature was once again tropical, and the crater was filled with sunlight. I quickly stood up and looked behind me. The greenery around the edge was dripping with water. I stepped closer and could hear faint rain, like it was through thick glass. When I reached out my hand, it was hit with the cold rain, making me flinch. I couldn't believe it. Adrian was right. The crater was like a self-contained ecosystem. There was some kind of force field protecting it from the elements. There came a hissing sound from somewhere behind, making me spin around with fright. The sensible part of my brain said that now I'd witnessed this phenomenon, it was time to leave. But I found curiosity getting the better of me. I saw the animal bones more closely. Rabbits, maybe some squirrels and birds too. Some skulls looked larger, like they could have belonged to a fox or something. The hissing came again from the direction of the cave. Despite the temperature, I felt a shiver over my body. There came a glint from above in my peripheral vision. I looked up to see the threads of silk spilling from the trees, but there was something else, too. High up in the branches, wrapped in silk, was something metallic catching the light. I squinted and could make out a frame and wheels. A bicycle. "It was Kevin's," came a voice from behind, making me scream. Adrian stood there, holding what looked like a metal pipe. "What happened to him?" I said, my voice wavering as he stepped closer and I stepped back. "They looked for him for months, but none of this exists unless you enter that exact spot. It's barely a few feet wide." "What do you mean?" He pointed behind me. "If you'd come from that side, you'd be standing in the rain right now. But because you entered in that exact spot, you're shielded, completely hidden from the outside. Believe me, I spent weeks experimenting. To think this place could have gone undiscovered if I hadn't fallen where I did." I ran to the side of the crater, but was knocked onto my back. I sat up, disorientated, my nose bleeding. Adrian started to laugh. "I forgot to mention, once you find your way inside, you can only leave the same way." I got up and stepped to the edge again, feeling an invisible wall. The pin dropped. When I knocked my elbow a few days earlier, I must have knocked it on the wall on my way out. "Adrian?" I said, stepping around the edge of the wall. "What did you do to Kevin?" "It was dying," he said, pointing to the cave. "It can't leave this area, so it can't hunt." I looked at the cave in confusion. The spider? He shook his head. Similar in a lot of ways, but definitely not a spider. It's been here since December 1980, right around the time those mysterious lights were spotted. I don't understand. It's an alien, he yelled. It's not of this world, Mike. I shook my head, not wanting to believe him. Another hiss came from the cave. He looked into it and nodded, then raised the pipe and smiled. It's hungry. My stomach dropped. How do you know? It tells me, he said, tapping his head. In here. Since I found this place, I know things that I shouldn't. Like I knew you'd be here. Isn't that incredible? Don't do this, Adrian, I yelled, my eyes filling with tears. You're my only friend. He looked taken aback for a moment. Kevin was my only friend, too. Some things are bigger than friendship, Mike. This thing is extraordinary. It's more important than anything this world has to offer. I'm not going to let it die. But you could just feed it rabbits, I cried. Why Kevin? Why me? A rabbit isn't a substantial meal, he said. They're scraps. But don't worry. It won't take long. Kevin only screamed for a few minutes. I made a run for it, feeling my way around the wall. There came a loud screech from the cave, which chilled my blood. I felt my arm go through the wall, followed by the sensation of rain. Relief washed over me until I was yanked back by the hood of my raincoat. I fell to the ground. Adrian stood over me and brought the pipe down. I covered my face, and pain shot through my forearm. He brought it down again in the same place, making me scream out. I managed to shift my body and spun around, knocking him over in the process. We tussled with the pipe. His face looked so different, hateful. I couldn't believe he was the same person I had grown to love like the brother I never had. But he was trying to cause me serious harm, and I needed to stop that. I gave it my all and pulled the pipe from his hands, swinging it hard against his head. He hit the ground. As I stood over him, catching my breath, I became aware of a sudden darkness in my immediate vicinity. There was a screech, and I was knocked flying, landing a few feet away. It took me a while to focus, but I saw that thing at Adrian's side. It rolled his body over like it was checking up on him. Then it turned and roared, a dark mass scuttling towards me on multiple legs. I could see why he called it a spider. It's just this spider was the size of a car. I screamed as it lifted me from the ground with two arms at the front of its body. It was running back to the cave. I could see a cluster of blue, glossy spheres that I assumed were eyes. I still held the pipe. When it dropped me inside the cave entrance, I jabbed it into one of those spheres. It screeched so loudly I thought my eardrums would burst, its legs curling into itself. I took the opportunity to escape, passing a small human skull as I did. Mike, I heard Adrian groan. He was sitting upright, a blood trail down the side of his head. I'm gonna get help, I said, out of breath. They'll kill it, he said. Please, Mike. Someone needs to look after it. You fed Kevin to it, I spat. You tried to feed me to it. I don't owe you or it a thing. Adrian sobbed as I began to climb out. The cold rain hitting my face offered comfort as I jumped on my bike and raced home. I burst in the house, shouting for Mom, begging her to call Dad at work. She was so concerned that she did, and he stormed in some few minutes later, demanding answers. It took me a good hour to convince him to come to the forest with me. I was threatened with being grounded for the rest of our time in the UK. No TV, no Nintendo, no pizza. I can still picture the look on Dad's face when we got to the bottom of the crater. A combination of awe and terror. That realization that everything you thought you knew about the world was wrong. We didn't have to get too close to the cave for my dad to see the spider. It was just outside the entrance, feasting on something that was partially cocooned in silk. Dad cursed and pulled me towards him, covering my eyes. But it was too late. We left for the U.S. shortly after that incident. When the military got involved, I can only assume that thing from another world was killed. It got to enjoy one last meal. But there's one thing I've always wondered about in the years since. Did Adrian give himself willingly, or did it realize it would no longer be fed? You might wonder about it, but I think I know. It sounds to me like Adrian wasn't exactly alone in his own mind anymore, if you know what I mean. It's like if E.T. had been a horror film instead. This story has also unlocked a new terror for me, so that's nice. Now I have to walk around all day, frightened of accidentally stepping through an invisible portal and into a giant alien spider den. So I got that to look forward to. If you enjoyed this story, please check out the author's other work in the links below. Leave us a like on this video and subscribe to hear more stories like this one. Whatever you do, don't follow your friend who's holding bait into the spider hole. And don't fall asleep.